workshop 2 of the workshop series, Implementation of RED 2 and Beyond. In workshop 1, we focused on ongoing developments in member states and the role of RED 2, and the feedback we received was very encouraging. There are 3 future sessions, workshops 3, 4, and 5, which focus on biodiversity, a discussion on carbon, forest, and climate impacts, and our final session in January on the social impacts of woody biomass. Today, our focus is on biomass supply from inside and outside of the EU. Our objective is to provide the perspective of end users from speakers representing large and small forest holders, pellet producers, a wood chip producer, and an end user. And the perspectives will be from both the EU and US perspectives. But before we proceed further, I would like to take this opportunity to present the 3 organizations responsible for this workshop series. And for that, I will share my screen. Okay. And Dirk, if you can confirm that it's visible.
All good.
Okay, good. First, I would like to start with IEA Bioenergy TCP. This is the Technology Collaboration Program within the International Energy Agency. The goal of the Technology Collaboration Program is, as the name implies, to collaborate, but also to provide a platform for information exchange on bioenergy research, technology development and demonstration, and policy analysis. This group also facilitates the commercialization and market deployment of environmentally sound, cost competitive, and socially acceptable bioenergy systems. The work program itself is carried out through the task and special projects and covers the full value chain. As you can see from this particular graphic, there are a number of contracting parties. Asia, Europe, and the Americas are all represented. The budget of this group is about 1.9 million in US dollars. There are currently 11 tasks and special projects underway within this group. There are roughly 106 participants in the task, but direct participation really, by the time it flows down, is well over 200 people. And we appreciate having them as one of the organizers. ETIP, the European Technology and Innovation Platform, has a unique role to bring together actors from various segments, from academia, civil society, industry, in the development of sustainable bioenergy and biofuel technologies. Its goal is to represent an unbiased opinion and try to unite and consolidate the view of industry and all of the players in Europe. And it acts as the main interlocutor for DG RTD as far as implementation of strategic energy technologies in the fields of bioenergy and biofuels. The ultimate goal is to develop some cost competitive world-class bioenergy value chains to create healthy industry and to accelerate sustainable deployment of biofuels and bioenergy and the materials that make up those particular products. It's also a goal to promote knowledge and assist in the coordination of research and technology development for lower carbon technologies. Transitioning to the Sustainable Biomass Program, the purpose of SBP is to facilitate the responsible use of biomass while enabling climate goals to be met. And this is accomplished through 4 different objectives, which are assurance, certification, communications, and organizational development and resource. The interesting thing about SBP, I think this morning I saw an announcement where the 300th certification had occurred. So that's a significant milestone in what is relatively a very young organization. This gives an idea of the magnitude of the flows of biomass into Europe and talks about where they come from. So the production of SBP certified biomass has steadily increased, and more of the material that's being used throughout the world is becoming SBP certified. So I would like to thank all three of those sponsors and organizers. And with that, I will continue. So hopefully we have taken the opportunity to review the advanced presentations from the speakers. Today, each of the speakers will provide a high-level overview of their thoughts, essentially an executive summary of their recorded presentations. At the conclusion, I will turn over the podium to Uwe Fritsch, who will provide the speakers an opportunity to provide any last thoughts or clarifications. And then we will move into a breakout session where we will have more opportunity for discussion and dialogue between the participants. And hopefully these discussions will lead to some additional questions for the plenary session, which Uwe will then return to moderate. Before proceeding with the speakers, I will turn to our facilitator and technical advisor, Dirk Hulverscheid, who will explain the tools we're using today and the many ways in which you can be involved in today's proceedings. Dirk, I will hand it over to you.
Thanks a lot, Mike. And warm welcome from myself. My name is Dirk, and I'm sitting currently in Germany. And so I would like to briefly walk you through the different tools that we're going to use. We're going to have 6 speakers, and they provide a short level introduction on the topic. You have access to all the extended presentations on the House-based platform as well. And let me just briefly walk you through it there. So our timeline is for about 1 hour. We have our speakers, including a short Q&A. And then we would have a solid half an hour, 45 minutes, including discussions in order to go into smaller breakout groups. Now, for those breakout groups, we had one big learning from the last webinar sessions there, where we had about half of the participants that were very interested in listening to the presentations, but basically disappeared during the breakout groups. So today I would really encourage you as well, if you would like to discuss, then stick around. Otherwise, come back and join us again at 5 o'clock for the plenary discussion as well. Because last time we had a few orphaned breakout groups with only one person talking to a few black tiles on the screen there as well. But I will go and make a short reminder on that one when we come to it as well. So from 5 o'clock CET, Central European Time onwards, we're going to reconvene all together in the plenary to basically process all the results coming out of the breakout groups. We use the discussion platform Housebase, where I've seen is already about 100 people actively on it at the moment. And I've just posted the link in the chat box here in Zoom. Our topic is too complex for just having a one element chat box like in Zoom, which is very linear. So we're going to use this one, the Housebase, in order to collect all your comments towards the specific speakers, but also to record later on the outcomes of your breakout groups there. And it's very straightforward. You just go and click on the link if you haven't signed up there. And it should take you to a registration page where you just have to type in your email address and then click the register button, please not the login button. You will get a dedicated private email, and then you just on one link you're inside, and it takes you immediately to the second webinar page where you can then basically scroll down and just find the relevant presentation, all the materials, and then post your comments and your questions for your colleagues. And of course, this one is your space for comment. So please also reply to other comments from people, or like what you read and hear in terms to keep this a lively debate. This space will stay online until the end of our webinar sessions, so you can always come back later on. So we really would like to encourage you to keep a lively debate even after today's session. In terms of how to best set up your screen, when you have your screen, I would recommend that you have the Zoom session in one area, and then the Housebase, which is a web-based browser window, on the other half of your screen, so you can easily iterate between the two different setups, so you can listen and see the different colleagues and presentations and type in your questions and comments as we move along. And then for the ones, if you're coming back to one of the next webinars that Mike has already introduced, is you can, on the top right, you have this button here phone under your avatar where it says add to your bookmarks. So you can actually make a bookmark in your browser window, so you don't need to actually go and set up a new invite every time as we go forward. But let's go for our discussions, and we will practice it as we start moving. Back to you, Mike.
Okay, thank you, Dirk. I would like to start out. I'm actually the first speaker, so I will introduce myself, so to speak. I will begin the presentation on U.S. large holder forest owners. I work for the Westervelt Company, a large holder forestry concern in the Southeast U.S. Our company owns in excess of 500,000 acres of forest. We operate sawmills and we provide environmental mitigation services. My exposure to the forest product sector includes 35 plus years in forestry operations, sawmilling, pulp and paper, packaging, and bioenergy. And along with Dr. Martin Junninger, I am a co-chair of the SBP Standards Committee. So with that, I will share my presentation. And okay, Dirk, are those clear on the screen?
Spot on.
Okay, great, thank you. So I would like to start providing an overview of the pre-recorded discussion items from last week. First, just some highlights, which I think by now most people are aware. Forested area heavily in the southern U.S., southeast and eastern seaboard. 50% of these lands of the forest are privately owned, and there are roughly 11 million landowners. So that a key point here being that very fragmented ownership compared to other countries. Interestingly, actual harvests only occur on less than 2% of the forest land per year. And 92% of those products that come from those lands are really from the privately owned lands as opposed to publicly owned lands. Another key point that I would like to make is that we have abundant and growing resources. For example, in the state in which we have the majority of our ownership, there are more standing trees today than there were 100 years ago, and that continues to be the case. It continues to grow. We have sustainably managed lands, protected habitats, and contrary to what some might perceive to be the case, there is really a very strong regulatory environment in place. Some forest owner perspectives that I'd like to recap. In general, there's a lack of awareness of RED II, but there's one particular reason for that. It's not that there is a lack of interest, but in many cases when forest owners or anyone in the industry is dealing with someone in bioenergy, they typically see the biomass producer as the face of that activity. So a biomass producer would come to us and say, these are my requirements, these are my sustainability needs. Can you meet these requirements? They're really conveying to us not only their individual requirements, but also the requirements of FSC and SFI and of RED II. So that is one reason why RED II itself doesn't have the name that's out there. It is a third party that is really introducing that to the landowners. The other point that I think is important to make is that, and I said this in my taped message, the RED II language is not likely to influence existing processes because many forest owners believe they already have effective existing processes, and many of those processes and actions, for example, best management practices, otherwise known as BMPs, really marry well with the RED II requirements. So if you were to create a checkbox and go through, you would find many of the things that are in RED II are already in effect and are working well in the forest. Bioenergy markets in general for large-scale forest owners typically don't drive forest decisions. Those large forest owners are most often there for another reason, and that is to produce OSB, or it could be lumber, or it could be pulp and paper, and that is how they manage their forest. Now, it is very important that we have bioenergy markets because those provide outlets for other materials. For example, if you were to look over the last 20 years, you would note that pulp and paper in the US has declined and has moved offshore. And as a result, some of those byproducts that we used to sell into those markets, for example, as a sawmiller, now go into the bioenergy market. So while one sector of the forest products shifted, another has stepped up to hopefully take its place. So the other important point here is that, when something like RED 2 comes along and perhaps a RED 3 or 4, those changes take decades to realize. In the case of US South, where it's primarily southern yellow pine, it could take 20 to 30 years or more to realize changes, because that's the typical rotation period. So it's not something that we can immediately change once a new directive is published. Are the markets important? Absolutely. Forest owners will say yes, they're important. We have many, unmerchantable materials that come from our activities, tops and limbs, for example. And it's increasingly difficult to find outlets for those materials. So bioenergy markets are very important in that respect. Sawmill operators, absolutely. As a sawmill operator, our objective is to use 100% of everything that we bring onto that site. But some byproducts are unavoidable, the dust, the shavings, chip, and bark. So we need outlets for those materials. We don't want to burn those materials. We can't leave those materials sitting around in piles. We would like to see those used in other products. So it is important for the sawmilling portion of the industry to have a strong and active bioenergy market. So is there a willingness to change on the part of a forest owner? Many forest owners will tell you that they're acting in a responsible manner, and they will continue to do so, but we already provide access to data. We have access to our personnel and our timberlands for audit purposes. We respond to certification scheme audit requests. We openly share information with producers when they perform audits of our practices, and we have voluntary certifications, and we maintain those. Most large landowners that you see, forest owners in the Southeast US, will have certified land. It is very rare for a large forest owner to not be certified to one of the recognized schemes. So just some key observations, and then we will wrap up. I think complexity leads to confusion. When we have a number of member states plus the EU itself, and you take all those in consideration, it's like, I think I mentioned this before, it's like driving down the street and there being 26 or 27 different speed limit signs. Which one do you follow? It becomes very confusing. It's also important to have appropriate regulation to allow forests to remain as forest. The last thing anyone wants to see happen is conversion. And in some cases, the influence of the market itself can be more effective than legislation. So legislation that is put together in pieces does not necessarily instill confidence in landowners, because they don't know how to plan, they don't know how to budget, and they don't really know what to do to try to satisfy multiple requests. So as a final thought, I guess I would put a question back to the audience, and maybe some of the discussion in the breakout groups can touch on this. But based on your knowledge of the practices of what we do in the South as a large forest holder, what would you have us do differently from this point forward? And hopefully that will spur some conversation, and we can touch on that later in the plenary session. Okay.
Great. Thanks a lot, Mike. Perfect timing. You set a perfect benchmark of exactly 7.5 minutes for everybody else to follow. For the other ones, as you have your direct comments and questions for Mike, I would invite you to share them on the HowSpace platform in the relevant chat box under Mike's presentations. You will also find a downloadable version of his presentation slides. And after we heard from all 6 speakers, we will have a chance to get from each speaker a few comments and perhaps some answers already before we go into the breakout groups. Thanks so much, Mike. Who's following you?
Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Jennifer Jenkins, who is the Vice President and Chief Sustainability Officer for ENVIVA. And she will offer perspective on RED II compliance from the perspective of a U.S. biomass producer. Dr. Jenkins brings a technical background in carbon cycling and ecosystem science and more than 20 years of experience working in government, academia, and the private sector at the interface between forest and climate. Dr. Jenkins, the stage is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So, okay, confirm this works for everyone?
Spot on.
Okay, great. Yeah, so thanks a lot, and it's a pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the opportunity to present to the group today. What I'll do in this version of the talk, it's just a shorter version of the online recorded talk, so I'll try to summarize and sort of hit the highlights here. You know, what I'm really going to do is talk a little bit about our work with small landowners, right? Because unlike Westervelt, we actually don't own any land. We purchase all of our wood to make pellets from suppliers who work directly with landowners in the Southeast US. Southeast US is predominantly forest, you know, as Mike pointed out, covered with forest, and you know, about 85 to 90% of that forest is privately owned. And so broadly, you know, what I'll do is talk a little bit about the context for the conversation in terms of ENVIVA, who we are, you know, wood pellets in the US forest. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about our own responsible wood sourcing program, because that's really the foundation for how we, you know, how we meet the RED II and RED I, frankly, and all the certification requirements that that are out there and that we're subject to for our customers. Again, this is ENVIVA. We have 9 facilities throughout the Southeast US with corporate headquarters up in Bethesda, just outside Washington, DC. Total capacity this year is just under 5 million tons a year of wood pellets. You see the orange dots here are plants under construction. So by about 2024, our capacity will grow to about 6.5 million tons of pellets a year. In terms of forest context, this data comes from the US Forest Service, and it's from the Inventory and Analysis Program through the RPA, or Resources Planning Act assessment, that's published every 5 years. So these are data from 1953 to the present, showing relatively steady removals, and removals is just another word for harvest. So you can see harvest down here, the orange line, pretty steady year over year. At the same time, we see an increase in forest inventory. You know, and that inventory in the US South has roughly doubled since about 1953 over the last 60 or 70 years. This graph shows you within ENVIVA's sourcing regions pretty much the same thing. So these dotted lines are removals or harvests, and then the solid lines are inventory and inventory growth. So the trends that we see in the Southeast US overall, writ large, are also at play here, just within ENVIVA's sourcing regions, which are outlined in the map on the left. A few, you know, comments from us. One of the things we found is that, you know, and I've talked a little bit about this also in the comments on the House base. In our work with private landowners, really, we found sort of we can decide internally for ourselves, based on certification requirements and our own values, what we will and won't take, right? And so that's a really important decision-making process that we have at the tract by tract level. And so we've done a few things to define what we will and won't take. And I'm going to talk a little bit about our definition of good biomass here, and then talk about our responsible sourcing policy, which is another way we define what is and is not okay for our pellets. Good biomass is made from low-value wood. It's a byproduct of a sawmill operation or a planned traditional timber harvest, and it can come in directly from the forest. We call that primary wood, or it can come in as a byproduct of industrial processing, and we call that secondary wood. We don't want to make biomass from trees that could have another use, especially a longer lived use. We don't want to source biomass from a region where carbon stocks are not increasing, right? So good biomass comes from a place where carbon stocks are stable or increasing. Good biomass comes from harvest practices that safeguard biodiversity, and also from a forest that will be returned to forest after harvest. Putting in a quick plug here for a white paper that we published back in May. This talks about the scientific and peer-reviewed foundations for our view of good biomass, particularly with emphasis in this paper on greenhouse gas emissions and carbon cycling. So responsible sourcing policy is, as I said, sort of how we, these are the guidelines that we use to define what works for us in our pellets. And our policy is in 3 parts, right? And so the first part is sustainable forestry standards. We source primary materials from a supplier, again, when that forest source will be replanted or regrown as a forest, in other words, no conversion. We protect water quality in the harvest area through BMPs, and we ensure that HCDs are not threatened by harvest activities. The second part of our RSP is transparency and verification. This is where we talk about certification, verification, our track and trace system. We do report twice annually on our progress toward the goals we laid out in our RSP, and that's all available online. I think in the recorded presentation, you can see links to all that information. And then finally, the last section of the responsible sourcing policy is our pledge to collaborate with stakeholders to address some of the most vexing sort of landscape scale issues that all of us in the forest products industry really have a hand in working on. And so this is, how do we keep forests as forests, right? So how do we keep the amount of forest land stable or increasing? How do we conserve wetland forest ecosystems, peatland forest and high carbon tropical forests? One of the things we found is even when we might walk away from a tract that we deem too sensitive to harvest, that doesn't necessarily mean that tract will remain standing, because there's a lot of actors in our landscape. And then, conversion of forest types that provide high quality habitat, and also restoration. Last thing here, and I did borrow this slide from Michelle at Navigant in the last workshop. This is, the sort of the criteria and the RED 2 language. The conservation and enhancement of carbon stocks and sinks is really the key to participating in the biomass market as a potentially a country not having ratified the Paris Agreement or having been part of the Paris Agreement. And so we do find, and I hope I've made the case, that the trends in carbon stocks in our regions are quite favorable, and we're not concerned about long-term maintenance of those stocks and that productivity, as long as the forest products market remains strong. So that's all I've got. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And for everyone, if you have questions or comments to Jennifer's presentation, please use the corresponding chat box on the house page. There's already quite a discussion going on there. She will have some time during the other presentations to scan through the comments, answer a few ones before we go into the breakouts, and then we have this as a basis for our plenary discussion. Thanks so much, Jennifer. Mike, who's next on our speaker?
Okay, so our next speaker is Mikhail Ugasti, who is head of quality and certification systems for ENVIVA'S, Europe's largest pellet producer and one of the largest private forest land owners in Estonia. In addition to his certification expertise, Mikhail brings an engineering and environmental sciences background to our discussion, and he will focus on RED 2 criteria in a multinational supply base.
So hello, everyone. Hope you can hear me.
Perfect.
So indeed, I will talk about the RED 2 criteria from a multinational supply base perspective. As mentioned, I work for ENVIVA'S. We are are famous for wood pellet production since it's our oldest business stream, but we are very much committed and dealing with renewable heat and electricity production through CHPs. We own and manage our own forest portfolio, and we are also developing biochemicals fractionation plant, which is in the first demo and testing stages today. So 12 plants across Europe and one in USA, 6 CHPs, forest portfolio of 55,000 hectares, where we plant roughly 1.5 million trees, which turns out about 2.5 trees for every tree that we cut. And last but not least, the biorefinery, where we derive wood sugars and high purity lignin from wood-based residues. First tests are going on and successful, so interesting times here. So what we are essentially trying to do within our company is double cascading externally and internally. On to the topic. So as I mentioned, our supply base really is multinational, since the feedstock is coming from 10 different countries, including non-EU countries. And to make matters worse, or maybe not, we'll see, all feedstock is coming from different FM schemes and chain of custody schemes. So our first attempt to mitigate the uncertainties of the RED II is keeping as high as possible percentage of feedstock coming from EU countries, which are very likely to get RED II compliance on A level. We are relying actually on the RED II Bio's first assessments here. Also, obviously keeping a high percentage of certified content and only using 100% certified suppliers, which makes sense. Also, we are promoting really small forest owners to implement the forest management plans before we even discuss management. So even today, as we are talking about the RED II on a almost theoretical level, or the criteria, we are facing difficult choices, since in our region, 2021 fiber contracts are negotiated today. So we really don't know what to give preference to. Should we go for a high percentage of RED II compliance on A level, or should we go for higher percentage of FM certified content, or should we even focus on the GHG profile? No real knowledge here today, I must admit, but we have to decide basically within the next weeks. But also, I think there still is reasons for optimism, as the harmonizing the sustainability criteria in the EU will bring a lot of important positive aspects to this industry, and I think a lot of skepticism will go away, and a lot of really sustainable biomass will be mobilized in the right manner. And I strongly believe that the currently used bioenergy industry standards for certification will have a high recognition percentage. But when there's optimism, there's concern. The current language really suggests that in the early stages, some sustainable operators and biomass could fall out of compliance. I think there's a high risk of sort of ridiculous mass balancing tricks, where a material that is not compliant in the early stages, but has a chance to be compliant in the following months, might be shipped, but then later declared differently. So that's something I think business does not need. So we have to be mindful of mitigating and avoiding those. And to maybe echo what Mike says, large forest owners will not change their practices. So if there's a situation where, for whatever technicality, large owners' biomass will not comply, then actually very sustainable biomass is becoming, well, that resource is not available, although it's something we really, really want to mobilize, and the resource efficiency of maybe very large players will drop for a short period of time. And to conclude, no real reasons to fear the RED II, because I think the overall aim is the same as the whole bioenergy sector has. But the confusing implementation strategy will most likely at first fuel criticism before we see the real benefits of the criteria. And I really strongly believe that the European Commission's efforts should be on effective implementation rather than trying to review the RED II criteria in the sort of next month. And I think especially when the sort of process sees that in the first years there will be a revision of implementation. Therefore, I don't know why the pre-implementation revision is necessary, and I don't see how it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikhail. Very, very interesting comments. And just as a reminder to participants, please, if you have comments or questions that we can later discuss during the breakout groups, utilize house space to memorialize those, and that will generate some, hopefully, questions from some of the other participants as well. So for our next speaker, I would like to introduce Ernst Eriksson, who is the production manager at ID Denmark, which is a multinational company with various business interests including wood chips, forest management, and many other sectors. Ernst is a forester with training from the University of Copenhagen, and he manages the wood chip business, which includes sourcing, production, logistics, trade, and certification. So Ernst, I will turn the podium over to you.
Hello. A little unprepared from my side here. I'm a Danish forester working for the Danish company in Denmark. We are doing wood chip supply for the Danish market and sourcing wood chips in the North European market, and is also doing timber trades for the, so to say, old industry. We are managing forests in the 3 Baltic countries and in Denmark for mainly private forest owners. I'll tell you a little about the Danish situation regarding, or in the perspective of RED II. Here by us, the situation politically was maybe a little ahead of the, so to say, average in Europe. So we had a strong debate about these things a number of years ago. And here's the perspective by us at the moment. Just briefly about the wood chip market and the forestry. We have 140 plants here in Denmark using wood chips, and they are consuming a sum of 4 million tons. Those bigger than 20 megawatts are taking off 75% of the total, and those bigger than 2.5 megawatt is taking off 97%. And there's a split between domestic and imports of 50-50. The forests, we have few forests. We have a lot of forest owners with a lot of, and a lot of those are having a very small forest estate. And the certificate percentage of the private forest owners is low. The supply chain, do remind yourself that half of the I know a major part of the wood chips comes direct from forest, and very little comes from a secondary source. So a typical supply chain here is, of course, and then there's a production and supply company holding the contracts and holding the certificates, and then of course the off-taker, heat or power producing company that is holding the certificates and is collecting the certification, but also those, as we heard from Mike or someone else, is that are setting up the demands for what to be documented. The background, 10 years of heavy public debate about these issues regarding sustainable bioenergy from forests and carbon balance and biodiversity issues and so on. That has been our situation for a long time. So by 2016, the energy companies made a, so to say, voluntarily agreement with the government saying that all the plants bigger than 20 megawatts should documentate the following, that by 2019, they should have reached a documentation level of 90% of the total volume, though excluding what comes from outside forests. And this documentation should hold documentation of protecting ecosystem, vulnerable nature, social and labor rights, and meet CO2 emission savings on a high level. The documentation schemes were PFC and FSC and SPP. This was 2016. Now we are in 2020, and we have achieved a national legislation. It's Bodil told a little about that on the previous workshop. This is has been agreed politically and is now going through the system, so to say. It says that all heat units bigger than 2.5 megawatts should documentate the full volume, including the material coming from outside the forests. The carbon sink nature and social and labor concerns and so on are the same as before. The carbon stock, well, if the country in question is inside the Paris Agreement, it's taken care of there. If the country in question is outside, then it has to be documented. The carbon stock level and carbon sink capacity has to be documented on the forest in question. The CO2 emission savings are still on an ambitious level, the highest in Europe, and the schemes we don't know by now, but expect to be at least the PFC. Just very short about being a small Danish supplier of wood chips, what do you do then when this first voluntarily scheme and later on here this legislation comes in play? Well, of course, first you have to establish a documentation scheme. You have to do a risk assessment and find what is specified risk, and of course address what was specified. You have to get the chain of custody system in place. You have to do some bookkeeping on your specified risk. You have to register some extra production data due to the CO2 emission calculation. And you have to do a lot of education on your management and your operators, those that actually are felling the trees. And you have to set up a control system. That is shortly what you need to do as a supplier. And of course, how did it go? Well, that's of course the very big question. And there's 100 answers on that. I think the most easiest way to answer it, as here by 2020, all biomass producers actually encouraged the government to make a national law and to make it cover the whole market, going from 75% to plus 95% of the total Danish produced volume. What did we learn in this coming during these 4 years? Well, a lot of small forest owners, a lot of fairly small biomass producers, still we could work out a system that functions, and we have done this in the SPP framework. It takes a lot of practical impact in the daily operations, and you cannot just go on like you did before. And very few biomass producers have left the business. There'll be an extra cost on the product, of course, an estimate of 2% from my side. The trees outside forest is actually a big share here in how the Danish landscape looks. And we have no documentation scheme for that. So that's an unsolved problem that seems also to be international. And then regarding the culture in forest, you can say we came from some hardcore production mindset towards also integrating these these softer concerns. And you have to be aware of that, you have to pay attention to it, and you have to be patient, because of course cultural change takes time, but that's also a part of the solution, so to say. On the other hand, it has been very positively recognized by the people working in forest that these extra demands came up. Of course, not the paperwork, but and of course, setting up a system where you don't documentate everything as sustainable, that is also a weak point for you as a business, because what about the share that wasn't documented? What about that? And this discussion about carbon stock balance, I think that will go on for 100 years. That is the big issue when you try to address things in public. Regarding the imports, that is about 50% of the total consumption of wood chips in Denmark. Well, here it seems that the exporting markets has, in the situation, so sent the certified material towards us, and then kept the uncertified material for their domestic market or their other export markets. A little perspective about Northern Central Europe, which is what is sort of around us, and what we know a little about. Well, the structure in business and forests and so on seems to be quite similar to what we know about here. And it matters, of course, how many links you have in your supply chain, how difficult this change is to do. On the other hand, the national forest legislation and the nature protection mapping is somewhat better in almost all other countries that here by us. And of course, and that has, of course, an impact to how the risk assessment turns out when you do that. So all in all, I think from our side, the conclusion is it puts on a lot of extra work. On the other hand, this has been a wanted, I think that's the most interesting thing, that this has been a wanted thing from the Danish forest owners and the Danish biomass suppliers to even tighten up the demands from national. I think that's quite uncommon in a situation like this. Yes, I think that was all for now. Back to Mike.
Okay, thank you very much, Ernst. Our next speaker, Dirk, if you could.
Yeah, Ernst, could you unshare your screen?
I'm trying to. What happened?
It's the big red button.
Yeah, I'm just trying to find the.
Ah. If Bjorn, could you try to initiate your share screen? That should actually take over from Ernst.
I tried to do that.
Sometimes the menu bar is hidden.
Okay, so while we're doing this, let me go ahead and introduce Bjorn. Our next speaker is Bjorn Roberts, who is a senior advisor with the Earthworm Foundation, formerly known as the Forest Trust. The focus of Earthworm is to positively impact the relationship between people and nature. And Bjorn was Earthworm's first full-time employee, and he focuses on working between companies and NGOs to bring about transformation. His topic today is on responsible pulp sourcing in Russia, which is relevant to every sector of the forest products industry. At the end of the day, it's really all about the forest, and what happens in the forest really is relevant to any sector of the forest, whether a forest products industry, whether it is pellets or lumber or pulp and paper, regardless. So with that, I will turn it over to Bjorn.
Thank you, Mike. Could I just check that you can see my screen? And
Yes.
Yes. Could you switch it into a full screen presentation mode? We see your presentation outline at the moment.
Aha. I'm afraid if I do that, you might get my voice speaking with in the presentation. Let me try. Yeah, there I go. I will. But is that okay to keep it like that?
Yep.
Otherwise, you'll get the recording as well.
It should be fine.
Yes, that works.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, and thank you also to the convening organisations and to Simon and Annie for inviting me to speak. Annie asked me to speak about, as we heard about, Earthworm Foundation's work in northwest Russia, which is principally with our pulp and paper members who buy packaging from the area. So I'm not speaking explicitly about RED II or biomass, but hopefully there is something of interest and use to you in here. A quick word about Earthworm Foundation. Mike has already introduced us, but just to say that while most of our work, all of our work is in working in supply chains of grown commodities, most of it is in the tropics with products like palm oil and soy. But we're also active in what we call the Forest Products Group, and that's made up of members who are buying packaging and paper products, and also biomass. So DRAX and ENVIVA are among our members. And our basic model is to work with our members to help them to formulate, sometimes if it's needed, their policies and sourcing guidelines. And again, if it's needed, transparency back to sourcing areas, and then to make environmental and social impact assessments, and where we find a problem, to make plans with our members and with their supply chain partners and other stakeholders to address those issues. So to the main subject of the presentation. So our pulp and paper members source quite heavily in northwest Russia, and in Arkhangelsk Oblast in particular, we found an issue there, which was that suppliers and their upstream suppliers, so the timber companies, while they were FSC certified, and there was no question about the legality of their operations, it was clear that there was a potential issue for our members in that it's an area with large areas of intact forest landscape and other old growth forests, and of course with biodiversity and carbon values attached to those. And that the forestry model that was being, or is being practiced in that region is described as expansive forestry, which really entails large clear felling, and Greenpeace describes it as timber mining. Really, it's a function of slow growth rates and long rotations, which means that to maintain production, harvesting is moving steadily into new areas of old growth and intact forest landscape. So for member companies, and particularly Nestle, this was an issue for them. Their responsible sourcing guidelines weren't necessarily broken as they were written, but they saw a conflict with their values, sourcing values. So we visited the area, met their upstream supplier and the forestry companies out deep in Arkhangelsk to understand their challenges and their limitations of what they could do, and discovered that there's a particular area called the Davinsky intact forest landscape, which WWF and Greenpeace were campaigning to protect from harvesting, and at the same time meeting with the forestry companies, understanding that they had few alternatives if they're going to maintain their fiber and lumber production, other than to continue to harvest in old growth and IFL. So we reported back to Nestle that this is the issue that we had found, and they then had a choice between either continuing to buy from their supplier as they had been doing, or potentially walking away, which they didn't want to do, but at the same time, which I haven't discussed yet, but shortly after we were there, a Greenpeace campaign to protect the Davinsky was launched. So they were threatened by exposure in that. But they had a third alternative, which was to become involved and try to improve conditions on the ground, which is what they chose to do. So just to go quickly through what those components were that allowed Nestlé to stay engaged and to continue to buy from the region. One was that after speaking with their supplier and also their supplier's forestry company and understanding their constraints, they nonetheless said that continuing to buy from the region would require their supplier to support legal protection of the Davinsky intact forest landscape. At the same time, they understood that this would mean quite a severe restriction in sourcing possibilities for the company. It's the Davinsky, but also that if this policy was then extended to other IFLs and other old growth forests, they would then be facing some really limiting constrictions on their fiber sourcing. So another part of their engagement was not just to tell their supplier what they should do, but also to support them to reach other models of production of intensified forest management in areas that had been cut previously, so not the old growth forests or IFL, to increase production in those areas, recognizing that that would be a long-term project, not something that would happen immediately, and that would also require support. So part of that support was also to fund improved remote sensing imagery of the total forest area, both to monitor the Davinsky intact forest landscape and to bring better information about the forest resource as a whole that could support improved forest management in the area. So as of today, the Davinsky intact forest landscape has received its full legal protection. Should really stress that that was the product of at least 10 years of hard work by WWF Russia and Greenpeace Russia. But then the voices of companies like Nestlé and others, particularly convened by FSE, helped to get the legal protection over the line. So 300,000 hectares of the core of the Davinsky are now under permanent protection. Then at the beginning of this year, WWF and FSC and Earthworm Foundation, we together formed a joint project with the main objectives there of identifying further areas of particularly valuable high conservation value forest through ground surveys and again remote sensing. Also to work with forest concessionaires who are willing to do so to support their intensification of sustainable forest management, and to develop other economic opportunities among communities out in the forests who are living close to the high conservation value areas where we hope there won't be intensive forestry in the future, but to develop opportunities such as ecotourism and non-timber forest products with those communities. So Nestlé and Mars, which is another Earthworm Foundation member, are funding that work and also the satellite monitoring. This year we have been a little bit, COVID-19 has stopped us getting out and doing much of the stakeholder engagement with forest communities that we would have liked to have done, but we'll pick that up hopefully early next year. And then we'll work to really try to foster ownership of the project objectives with the local forest industry, local government, and those communities. So the main takeaways I wanted to convey was that this was a risky situation for Nestlé. As I say, the basic due diligence criteria had been met, Their producer was FSC certified. There's no question of illegality or conversion of forests to other uses. But there was this problem of large-scale harvesting in IFL and of other old growth forest. So for them, the question was not could working with earthworm or in other ways, could they really fundamentally and quickly change these structural situations on the ground? That was not possible. But could they be part of the solution? Could they move the dial in the right direction? And if we could develop a model where they could see that their continued engagement was improving conditions, was promoting sustainable forest management in some areas and helping to protect the most biodiverse and carbon-rich forests in other areas, then they could see that their continued engagement was a positive thing. So a couple of other quick points there. In doing this, to Mike's earlier point, 27 speed limit signs on the road is not a good thing. So it was really important that Nestle went back. We visited the forests and went back through all of the supply chain partners, right back to the producers, to explain why it was that Nestle were making these requests. And actually they didn't make the request until they'd listened carefully. And at that point, they understood what the forest company's limitations were, but also were able to communicate to them why it was that they were asking them to do something beyond certification, which is where they got to. And by doing it that way, actually, we have developed a pretty fruitful and collaborative partnership with the producers as well there. So I think those are the main points that I wanted to get across, and look forward to discussing if anybody would like to know more.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Björn. And as for everyone, if you have questions or comments for Björn, as I see already, Bodil is just posting one now, please put them into the house-based chat boxes there. For all the other speakers, while we have our last presentation, please scan the relevant discussion. We will have a quick chance before we go into the breakout groups for you to make a few final statements or just answer one of the questions that you've seen coming in. But Mike, who's our last speaker?
Okay, so our next speaker is Richard Pepperdy, who is Vice President of Sustainability at Drax Biomass. And I believe they're the largest consumer of biomass in the world. We'll let Richard confirm if that's the case. Although his background is that of a forester, Richard's experience ranges from the forest to biomass production, all the way through biomass combustion at the power station. And Richard has firsthand knowledge of U.S. forestry practices, having been based in the U.S. for a few years. So with that, Richard, I will turn the podium over to you.
And Richard, I have heard, is joining us via phone. That's why you see my screen being shared. So I've got his presentation. And Richard, if you just tell me when to advance, that would be great.
Yeah. Hi, Dirk. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, perfectly.
Yeah, thanks very much indeed. And I think Mike oversold me considerably there, but very happy to have this opportunity to talk with people. And Dirk, if you could just go straight off the sort of the cover slide to the first slide. I will just be giving a quick reprise of the full deck that I posted on HouseSpace earlier. So Dirk, if you're on the slide which just has the graph of Drax's history of biomass, if you tell me you're there, then we'll kick off from there.
Yep, it's on Drax history of biomass.
No, okay, let's go then. So the starting point is that we have used biomass for quite a number of years now, more than 15 years of experience of using biomass in different ways at the power station. It started with co-firing, trialing lots of different feedstocks, including, of course.
We don't see the screen. Oh, now it's on. Sorry.
It's okay.
You okay, Dirk?
Yep.
Yes, now it's okay.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, just confirming that we have had these, quite a number of years of experience, and 10 years or more, beginning to get significant volumes, a million tons and above. And at the moment, we have 4 units, which in total burn about 7 million tons of pellets. And this long history has allowed us to learn a fair bit, not just about sourcing biomass, but also about how to use it. And we've had to work out how it can be used in a technical sense in the power station, and also how we can fit into the grid. Let's go on to the next slide, please, Dirk.
Yes, it's on. It's a map.
Thank you very much indeed. So this is where our feedstocks come from. The main area of sourcing is the Southeast US, where about 65% of the feedstock comes from. The EU is the next largest supply area, with about 17%, 1.2 million tons coming from the EU, predominantly Latvia, Estonia, and Portugal being the countries that supply from the EU. Western Canada is the next largest area, British Columbia, a little bit from Alberta, and some from Eastern Canada, and a small amount of material comes from Brazil. So the UK is a small, crowded island. We don't have a large amount of our own natural resources. And prior to burning biomass, we did import a lot of coal. We continue to import a lot of natural gas. So the fact that some commodities that we as a small, as I say, populous island do come from overseas shouldn't come as a surprise to people. And of course, for this particular discussion, talking about biomass, then understanding how that can come to us safely and securely and sustainably is important. So if you go to the next slide, Dirk, I'll talk briefly about how effective regulation and standards are essential to us. Do you have that slide up?
Yes, it's up.
Okay, so thank you very much. So when we first started using biomass, there weren't as many regulations in place as there are now. But from the beginning, Drax has recognized the importance of sustainability in its supply contracts, and it has been a built-in contractual requirement for all of our suppliers to meet the requirements that we have, and how and whether our suppliers are meeting them has been subject to independent third-party audit for many, many years. Prior to SBP, before many of the current regulations came in. So we've always recognized this is important to us to meet our own values and to meet the values of wider society. But we're really pleased to see a wider set of accepted regulations come in. So when the UK Renewables Obligation Order developed and built itself out to include some timber standards, which included that sourcing is in a way consistent with, for instance, Forest Europe's sustainable forest management criteria, we think that's a good thing, and we're pleased to see that kind of development. And built into those criteria are such aspects of productivity being maintained, harvest levels that not exceed the capacity of the forest, ecosystem health and vitality is maintained. So these there are wider requirements around biodiversity and social aspects, which are of course important. But these existing criteria are not silent about aspects which are important to the carbon question, which we will touch on in talk number 4 in this series. Of course, the UK regulation has been buttressed by activity in Europe, not just EUTR, but the original RED and the RED 2 as it develops. And none of these things develop in a vacuum. They can rely on existing forest management standards like FSC, SFI, Tree Farm, PFC, to try and understand what good forestry and bad forestry looks like. And we look at and learn from all of those things. And so that in the context of this particular discussion, it's great that many of these core requirements are brought together in one standard, within the Sustainable Biomass Programme. And we look forward to how the multi-stakeholder approach helps develop the standard. Can you move on to the next slide, please, Dirk? And I'll talk a little bit about how biomass can fit into a grid.
Yep, that's a graph with a lot of curves.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. So this is the picture of the UK grid over the bank holiday weekend earlier this year. In the full deck, which is posted on Housebase, I give this a little bit more context. So the UK grid is recorded live, and you can look at it at any time. But the purpose of this slide was to show that even at a time of extremely low demand, which is shown by that blue line at the top, the blue wavy line is the total demand in the UK, which you can see at times gets below 20 gigawatts. That's a very low level of demand. Demand is normally 35 to 40 gigawatts, so really low levels of demand. even at that low level, there was still a requirement for biomass, which is the brown line sort of second up from the bottom. And the rest of the lines show how the rest of a dynamic modern grid has to respond. To pull out some lines, the very regular lumps as you move from left to right across the page from the bottom, that's solar. Each day the sun comes up, the solar guys pump out some juice, there it is. The very steady grey line is just the nuclear plants just pumping out energy steadily. The light blue line near the bottom is wind. On some of the days the wind wasn't blowing, but then it did start to blow. And the yellow line is one of the ways that gas tries to fill in the space. So in a modern grid, these things are dynamic. And biomass does fit in. Even in these very low demand situations, it was needed. And one of the reasons it's needed is it provides a thing called inertia. The big spinning heavy metal generators in a power station, thermal power station like ours, help keep the frequency of the grid stable. So there is a role for us in a modern grid. Can you move us on to the next slide, please, Dirk?
Sure. It's the one with BECCS and negative emissions.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for confirming that's the right slide. So in today's grid, we have a role, and of course for tomorrow and the future, where all the experts are telling us that the world will need to find ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere. BECCS, biomass with carbon capture and storage, has a role to play. And the graph is showing what the Committee on Climate Change think about this. And the multicolored stack shows you how much hard-to-abate emissions they think exist in the UK. So things like aviation and agriculture amount to quite a substantial amount of carbon that you simply can't wish away. It does have to be taken out by some kind of negative emission technology. And the total amount that needs to be removed, they think in future will be the green slab. And the amount that we can provide at DRAX, if we capture all the carbon in our chimney, is the last little bar that you see on that chart there. So we think we have a role in today's grid, and we think we have a role for tomorrow. And I think my last slide, Dirk, will just give you the conclusions I reach.
It's on.
Thank you very much. So yeah, so bioenergy isn't new. We've been doing it for a long time, and we have learned a ton of lessons about it. It can be done in multiple geographies. It provides some complications, but we've shown it can be done. And these benefits arrive not just today, but tomorrow as well. And I'm looking forward to speaking with some of you again in workshop 4, when we'll take a deeper dive into the carbon story and everywhere we source. That's me done, Dirk. A little bit over, but I hope close enough.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Richard. And actually, can you see what's going on in the house space? Because there's already quite a few questions or comments towards your presentation. Otherwise, we will find a back channel to inform you about them.
Yes, I can see the questions on house space. Thank you very much indeed.
Great. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you again, Richard. Next, I would like to thank all of our speakers for their initial comments, and I will now turn the podium over to Uwe Fritsch, who is with the International Institute for Sustainability Analysis and Strategy, and he will provide each of the speakers an opportunity to maybe make a few closing comments or clarifications, and then after that, we will move into our breakout session, and that will be followed by the plenary session. So, Uwe, the podium is yours.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you all for being with us here this afternoon in European time. You heard 6 presentations which gave different flavors to the questions we have asked. There's a lot of communication already in the house space, so I don't want to replicate what you can see there, but to ask some of the speakers at least, and stimulate hopefully a quick discussion, some points which were, in my view, key. One is the question Mike actually gave us, just for remembering to discuss this in the breakout groups which follow. What do we want the US foresters to do differently? I think that's a very good question. And a question I would like to put to Jennifer. You said that you have already a resource base, no, actually a production base. Your sales are in the order of 5 million tons of pellets, and you expect to that this will grow to something like 6.5 million in 2024 due to new capacity. On the other hand, you see that there is a debate about restrictions, further sustainable curtailment, or whatever you want to call it. And at least in Europe, a couple of countries have decided to, we would call it phase out coal, or that coal-firing may not be an option anymore. Any views on that? So the impact of European legislation, not only the RED II, but the broader policy context towards your business? Jennifer, you understood my question?
Yeah, sure. So your question is about, what is the impact of sort of enhanced incentives for biomass, right, in other EU countries as they phase out coal, and how might that impact our supply base? Is that essentially the question? So, I mean, a couple of things. I think, first of all, we shouldn't overlook the important interaction between markets for forest products and forest productivity, right? There is data to show that there's a correlation between rates of harvest and rates of growth, and rates of inventory increase, and actually acreage, right? And so, in other words, one of the points I made in the house space was, you can see forests like any other commodity, really, right? The more demand there is for that commodity, the more of that commodity you'll see, right? That happens with any agricultural product, right? Corn, cows, anything like that, right? Of course, there's a limit, right? So, and I understand the sustainable scale of production is something people are very concerned about. We're concerned about it too. I think and I'll point to some work that was done from Wageningen and the European Forest Institute a couple of years ago, I think, where they pointed out, using a model that actually accounted for this important interaction between the forest products industry and productivity. I think they estimated that the sustainable production from the Southeast US of pellets was about 35 million tons. So if we think the Southeast US right now is producing somewhere between 8 and 10 million tons, we're not at that limit. And there's, and so we do have data to show, right, that inventory has continued to increase over the last 60 or 70 years. And there's an important, there's an important balance there. So hopefully does that answer your question, Yue?
A bit. So your resource base is secure, that's what I understand. And do you think that your markets are also secure in Europe, given the political dynamics we have? It seems like you expect that, right?
Yeah, we don't have any reason to think that they're not secure. I also think it's and also one of the things to note is that Europe is not the only market, right? There are other growing markets around the world. And so, I don't think there will be a drop in demand overall for wood pellets.
Thanks. Very clear message. Appreciate. Ernst, you mentioned in your presentation that there actually has been a demand from your market partners to strengthen some of your documentation and the requirements. Is it correct? Is it something, because that's typically the other way around, right?
Yeah, maybe I didn't highlight that, but the background for this move, which is, it is like you described, that actually we as biomass producers and also the forest owners actually encouraged the government to go a bit further, that it should cover all the material, or in fact all the material. And the background for this is, of course, the political situation in Denmark, and also as a forest owner, as a biomass producer, or a forestry advisor and management company, you can notice the fact that half of the production from forests is actually used for energy. And that is, I think, world record for a developed country. And the background for that is, of course, two things: that we have a big a market for wood. The other reason is that we have a very poor, and that came latest. And then before that, we had a very poor market for industry investments more advanced than only sawmills. So the only wood industry that we have here in our tiny little country is actually sawmills, and I think one pellet plant. That's about as advanced as it gets here. So we have no pulp factories. We have a very little board factory, but that's very, very little. So we have a surplus of poor quality from the forest, and we have high costs for production. So we cannot really export our poor quality. So that's the other reason why this was politically encouraged by the whole forest business to make a move towards the community or the society accepting politically that we are burning quite a big share of wood, because it makes sense in the Danish context. That was a long answer.
Oh, it's okay. I think it's an interesting case. And now I encourage the audience, unless you have already put your questions in the house space, which is always good, if there is an urgent need to ask a question directly to the speakers right now for clarification, the floor is open, and just raise your hands. You can do that if you're going to the practitioners, and then you can raise your hand, and hopefully we'll see that.
Yeah.
Or Mike will help me at least.
Uwe, this is Mike. I do have one clarification.
Okay, please.
That I would like to make. One of the things that I stated in my pre-recorded discussion and in the discussion today, that I stated that bioenergy does not really influence forest management decisions. And I think maybe a more appropriate way to say that is that we, as a large forest owner, we believe that what's good for the forest is also good for bioenergy. So really, there's some, they build on each other. So it's hard to do one thing for the forest in general and it not have a positive impact on pulp and paper and lumber and bioenergy and other sectors. So I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that those are mutually exclusive, because there really is a lot of symbiosis there between all of those different elements.
Thanks, Mike, for clarifying. I was wondering if you meant wag the dog, right? That something like that. So good to have you. Dirk, is there somebody raising the hand?
I can't see anybody raising their hand, but perhaps some of the other speakers had a chance now to read through all the comments and questions on their house-based page. Perhaps there's somebody else who just likes to make a clarifying statement or to be a little bit more precise on some of the points being talked about before we go into the breakout groups.
Those speakers, if you had a chance to take a look to the house space, any question you want to pick up now?
I had a couple of questions on the same theme, which was
Go ahead,
question
John.
of FSC. I mentioned that up there in Russia, the concessions that we were talking about were FSC FM certified, and yet we were looking for areas of high conservation value forest and talking about old growth forests and IFL being harvested. And so I had a couple of questions asking how that was possible under FSC certification. And so, yeah, so this is back in 2016. IFL had been recognized as a form of HCV2, but it was, and is still, but was particularly a difficult one to deal with, to define what forest management restrictions should be applied to that, because these are such large areas in places like Arkhangelsk. Not only in Russia, also in northern Sweden and Finland, there's an issue there. So it was just so one of the outcomes of the projects that we hope for, and the FSC is one of the project partners, is that it will continue to inform how FSC and the national standard there treats IFL in Russia. But also just to note that this isn't a Russian issue only. So old growth forest is, although it tends to have higher biodiversity values and carbon values, it is not by default HCV forest.
Thank you for that clarification. Any more immediate responses from the speakers to questions or issues raised in the house space? No. Dirk, then I think you can take over and guide us into the breakout groups.
Yes, thanks so much, Uwe. So now we would have 20 minutes in terms to discuss in a little bit more private setting where we can also get a lot more tangible and technical. Based on last webinar's experience, this is now the point where there's quite a few people who are actually just interested in listening in on the presentations, and then we're quite active again in the plenary discussion. So if I could ask the ones who don't intend to discuss for whatever reason in more private settings, if you could join us again at 5 o'clock Central European time, that's in 25 minutes. And for the other ones that would like to have a little bit more private discussion exchange with their colleagues, we would have now 20 minutes to go and discuss in a private setting all the things that we've heard, and perhaps prepare a couple of provoking statements for the plenary later on, and test the waters around it there. And then we will have a short bio break, and then come back for a final overall plenary. All right, the people are coming back from the breakout groups, and we have a lot of people knocking on the door again coming in. I would suggest that we take a 5-minute bio break just quickly for the people who've been in the breakout groups that didn't have a chance to get a fresh cup of tea. And then we would start again in 5 minutes at 7 past, wherever you are.
Thanks, Dirk. And maybe you put that in the chat that everyone knows it.
Yes, I will put it in the chat as well. And for the ones who are still on the call, I've also opened a poll on the house page, so you can already just click yes or no. Otherwise, we do that when everybody's coming back in a few minutes. So for the ones who've just been joining again, as we take a short bio break, another 3 minutes, just please bear with us for the time being. Okay, when you're coming back from your break, it would be great if you could switch on your video. It makes it a lot more personal and nicer to talk to different faces instead of black tiles and names attached to them. It also gives us a good sign that people actually are back from the break. Right, so let me go and share my screen to show you where we are. So if you go to the house space, right at the very bottom, you will find under the, just above the overall comment box there is a statement. Other EU policies dealing with forest and wood product sustainability should actually follow the approach that RED II has taken. And we're interested, in order to kickstart our debate, to just get a simple yes or no from your perspective. Is that what we're after, Uwe?
Yep, absolutely. Yep. Thank you.
So let's see what we have. And then, of course, in the chat box right next to it, you can share any kind of comments if you like. And but let's see, do a quick vote of everybody, what the outcome is. Let's have a look at the results coming in. So based on a very small sample is overwhelming 3/4 majority for yes. I think we still have 60 people on the call, so let's go see if we can get at least 30 votes to have at least half. It looks like the trend is pretty straightforward. Is that surprising, Uwe?
Well, I would say not really surprising, because we had a lot of discussions around forests providing outputs not only to the bioenergy sector, so they are basically subject to broader policies. But I think it's encouraging to see that we have among, well, what's it now? 100? No, it's now 13. We still need I could encourage you to go to the vote and make your vote, please. That hopefully the majority of the participants have made their vote.
Yeah, we actually have a raised hand from Mary Booth.
Ah, Mary?
Hey, everybody. I'm
just a quick one,
wondering...
okay? Just a quick one. Just a quick one before we go into the discussion. Go ahead.
Well, just with regard to this question, I'm not sure that everyone understands that the sustainability criteria and greenhouse gas criteria in the RED are designed to ensure greenhouse gas savings compared to fossil fuels. And in my opinion, they don't accomplish that goal, but I don't understand why people think it's relevant to the pulp market to try and ensure greenhouse gas savings compared to fossil fuels when pulp isn't intended for use as energy. So could we clear that up before, because I feel like you guys are really trying to push this expansion of the RED II criteria to other sectors. I don't know if that's designed to kind of take the focus off of bioenergy or what the intent is here, but let's make sure that everyone understands what the RED II criteria actually do and do not do.
Well, thanks. I think we will have a whole workshop on that issue coming up. So I would not start the discussion right now. Mary, you are very welcome in the carbon workshop, where this surely will be an issue. The idea behind the question was to say, it's not just carbon from biomass compared to fossils. It's requirements such as maintaining carbon stocks and get out of biodiversity-rich areas and so forth. There's a whole variety of criteria in the RED II, already in the RED I, which are more or less singling out bioenergy as one. And there surely are other activities in the forests which affect carbon stocks and biodiversity. So why not widening the scope? That was one of the backgrounds. not to dilute or kind of take away the pressure from the bioenergy debates. That's where we are today. So with that, and having given already a hint to the next workshop, I would like to open the floor to a quick reporting back what we took out from the breakout groups. And I know that Martin Junginger was ready to report from his group. Martin?
Sure. So we took your question about what US forest owners could do to improve or to change into our discussion. I think what we realized that was on the one hand side, there is a problem with fire. We also had somebody, Anna from Portugal. So forest fires are a big issue. Overstocking of forest and using residues to reduce that risk is on the one hand side desirable. At the same time, there was also here in the house space reporting of bad forestry and let's say feedstocks which are undesirable, at least to some. So the big question was how can we shift, let's say, from feedstocks which are deemed unsustainable to let's say true residues which also have added benefits like residue use or forest fire prevention. The other major thing was that the use for energy ultimately was only deemed, of course, low-hanging fruit, which can be done very quickly. But in order to go to cascading high-value application, you need time and certainty in terms of investment and support. So it's easy to shout that we should go for high-value applications, but the truth is that pulp production at the moment or pulp demand is stable or not increasing as quickly as supply of low quality residues. So if we want to make bioplastics or other things out of it, that needs to be supported, and that should be done by, I think, a variety of actors. With regard to the role of SBP, the question was whether SBP should focus solely on certification, or as we heard also in the story about Siberia, basically, or the Arkhangelsk, whether it should take a more proactive approach in educating, especially, let's say, forest owners in terms of how sustainable forestment should be done. So to really make the additional step beyond just the complying with criteria. I think that was the biggest summary of what we discussed in 20 minutes. Apologies if I forgot anything.
That's what the chat is for. Thank you, Martin. I noticed that Pat House would also be able to quickly report. Pat, would you let us know? You must unmute yourself, then we can hear you.
Hi, sorry about that. Yeah, we discovered, we discussed quite a lot about what the regulations are going to do to the biomass industry, what the costs are going to be, et cetera, and came to the conclusion that what we really would like to see is regulations with very clearly defined goals based on, over time, an iterative process that looks at the experience and the outcomes and the impacts of what the regulation has been. And I think that's what most of our discussion covered. We also had an additional point, which was that we really wanted to create a stable environment which enables both implementation and investment in the area. So that would enable sustainability to be achieved in the long term. I don't know if anybody's got anything to add to that, but that was my conclusion of the discussion that we made.
Thanks, Pat. Again, additions easy to do in the chat. Justin Tate, you also had a brief summary. Would you share that with us?
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess, slightly a repetition of a topic that was covered last time as well, and I suspect one that will run through some of the rest of the workshops. And that is that when we see differing requirements in member states as they transpose the RED II, and we already see it in the Netherlands and right now, it's, how does that affect SBP's ability to actually be a meaningful standard across different markets and different jurisdictions? And somebody raised the question and phrased it in a way is, when does SBP not become SBP? It becomes, national level standards, for example. And what effect does that have? So it's, as I say, it's slightly an ongoing theme, I think.
Thanks for that. Clearly an issue for Martin and Mike and others to take up in their work. I can very briefly report that in the group I was participating in, we had two issues which I found interesting. One is, to what extent can contractual arrangements between pellet mill operators and forest operators guarantee the fulfillment of the criteria and indicators we impose? We had Michael explaining that, explaining that from his experience, this actually takes a lot of time. It's a process. It's not that you just sign a contract. And on the other hand, it's something where you also need a certain market power. So maybe that is an issue for pooling for small scale operators, as we do in the certification on the supply side. So that was one thing. The other was, and I found that quite interesting, from a private investor point of view, bioenergy looks, especially woody bioenergy, looks very vulnerable in terms of public acceptance, that it takes a picture or a statement from an NGO to actually hurt the business case, so that investors may actually shy away from that issue. And so even if you have a stable regulatory environment, if there is a kind of a hostile public towards that, you may have that as a hurdle. And I think that's clearly something people have been exposed to. So that was brought up. Any more news from the breakout groups?
Well, I can pipe up again for group one, because I posted a graphic from our Paper Tiger report, just pointing out that the forest carbon sink in a number of countries, including ones that have big biomass and pellet industries, has massively declined in recent years, including in Denmark, where it briefly went positive. So Denmark forests were a net source of emissions rather than a sink. So we had some argumentation back and forth about what the drivers are for that. And Richard Sikama was of the opinion that it's because forests are getting older, and this just shows that we need to log them more to increase the sink. And of course, me being a forest ecologist by training, did not agree with that.
Yeah, thanks, Mary. I think that's a good point. And we have a couple of articles in the literature covering that with pros and cons. And that surely is an issue you cannot talk just as such. It depends on the country where you are and the historical situation. We saw that from the US, where the inventory was presented by Mike, and we have other countries where, we have different dynamics, let's say. And in that sense, I would again be happy to say, let's take a closer look in the carbon workshop on that one.
The US forest carbon sink is also decreasing. I want to make sure that people on this call understand that for the carbon stocks can be getting bigger, but the rate at which the sink is sequestering carbon can be getting smaller. And
Sure.
The US forest carbon sink sequesters less carbon every year. Now, I'm not necessarily blaming that on the pellet industry or anything else. We've got a few other things going on here in the US, like beetle infestations and wildfire and that kind of thing. But the fact is that at the national level, US forests are now sequestering less carbon than they were previously. That's a fact.
Okay, I guess we take that into consideration, and Martin will be happy to discuss the issue in the carbon workshop. Now, when we talk about the international perspective of the RED II, that's what this workshop is about. We heard some arguments regarding, well, if the Europeans are crazy enough to put very stringent legislation into those markets, there are other markets around the planet, right? Is it something we should be concerned with? And that is a question mainly to the European colleagues, because I understand the willingness of suppliers from outside of the EU to seek the markets where they can get acceptance. So would there be a problem in that sense? And we heard in the case of Denmark that local production is of interest. Martin, if I may ask you about the few forests you have in in the Netherlands, is it seen as a resource? Is there a danger coming up that we may be too tight on the European side?
Well, I mean, I think the Dutch forests are indeed a very small part of our land use, unfortunately, and there is actually talk of afforestation. At the same time, it is also a very complex picture. So some of these forests are fairly young and could also sequester carbon if we just would leave them alone. At the same time, we see in Germany already the same thing as Mary just mentioned about beetle infestations. So we see that forests are becoming more vulnerable, and so just leaving them unmanaged may also be a significant risk in the future. We also see, interestingly, developments with regard to biodiversity. So where forests are actually converted into heath because of biodiversity benefits, but at the same time carbon losses. And at the last but not least, there is a very big interest at the moment in the Netherlands also to building with wood. And obviously, the Netherlands cannot ever grow enough wood for their own housing market. But the idea of using wood as a long-term carbon storage and linked to that afforestation and perhaps also bioenergy, these are all elements which are currently in the debate. I think at the moment, the Dutch forests are not in that sense in danger. We see still an increasing stock oversupply, but then again, it is a tiny amount compared to other countries in Europe.
Yeah, I was not so much aiming at the issue of your domestic forests, but at the trade component, so that you actually import a lot because local demand is comparatively high and growing, and you may, that was kind of
sure.
flavor.
So basically, imports are, of course, heavily debated. The Dutch PBL just published a report a few months back where they also show how different world views ultimately determine how much we should be able to import. So there's, let's say, the idea of a fair share. We should not consume than the average person, but then others argue that we are much more densely populated or have a more heavy industry requiring energy, etc. So the principles of how much biomass we are allowed to use is already heavily debated. Let's say pragmatically, it was just decided in the Netherlands, actually the government advice came out last Friday that biomass for electricity baseload will be phased out. And for low temperature heating, it will also be phased out, but it's unclear until when, because it's unclear also there need to be alternatives available. At the same time, the Dutch government encourages cascading, so the use for chemicals, for building materials, but also for aviation fuels and sectors where other renewables will not, on the next 10 years, have the opportunity to displace fossil fuels on a significant scale. So I think we see rather a shift and therefore still a continued need for imports rather than a stabilization or decline.
Okay, thank you. With that, I guess we can open up a little bit to the broader audience. If you feel like making an intervention, asking the colleagues again, maybe over the discussion, something came up to the speakers we had. They are still here. Even some of them are just on the phone, but we can talk. So the floor is open, and I would invite you to raise your hand, and Dirk will let me know once you do that. Is it okay?
Yep, and it would be good if you could use the raise hand feature, because we're spanned over two screens, and I will continuously move backwards and forwards to check any hands. While we go, Mary Bruce has raised her hand again.
Hi, everybody. It's me again. I had a question for Richard from DRAX about new evidence of old growth logging in the inland rainforest in British Columbia. And I posted some photographs and a link to a story about that under Richard's house base area, if y'all want to look at that. So I'd like a response about whether DRAX is still intending to source from Pacific Bioenergy and Pinnacle Pellet, which are two of the companies that have been implicated in concessions and old growth. And then also I wanted to just point out that there was recently a lawsuit filed against the government of South Korea on bioenergy by the solar industry. 60 solar cooperatives filed a suit against the government, saying that subsidies for bioenergy were outcompeting solar. And so I'll post a link to that, to our press release about that in the chat box here in the discussion area. But check that out. It's an interesting case.
Thank you. It's always good to know what's going on. We also have a debate in Japan about bioenergy and its sustainability, which is good. It's not just the crazy Europeans. Response from DRAX.
Yeah, can you hear me, Uwe?
Yep, absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah, just checking I'm not on mute. So yes, Mary, I'm currently responding on House Space. So check it out in a few minutes when I've completed my response. And yeah, we do source from Pinnacle and from that geography. I don't think it's really. It's not necessarily pertinent whether we specifically source from them in order to answer your question, though. I think there are several layers to your question. Posted on House Space. One is whether the felling should have taken place at all. You allude to there being some kind of special trees in the forest, and there will be a wide range of civic responses about which trees should be felled and which shouldn't, and not everybody will agree about that. But in that geography of British Columbia and Alberta, there are very extensive legislative procedures and processes, consultation processes before these kinds of felling decisions are taken. So there's a degree of civic involvement which you don't really get in many other places in the world. Please don't think that means that I believe that everybody agrees with all of it. They don't. But these rural societies that have a particular resource on their doorstep, I personally think it's right that they end up making their decisions about how they use them, and they do reach those decisions. And I should add that in the decision to fell for these forests in Western Canada, there is an extremely high degree of certification. So it's in the high 90s. So there's forest management certification of these forests to consider whether the basic forest management processes are taking place. Your picture has a picture of some logs going into a mill. I don't think these are ever really very informative about the wider dynamic. So I sort of hesitate to speak about them because I simply don't think they tell any meaningful kind of story. But when I do look at them, what I see is rotten logs, and I see misshapen logs. And when I look at the story that you've posted to in the narwhal, and look up and down that story, I see heaps of logs prepared for burning, which are about the same size and shape, well, not dissimilar to the size and shape of the ones on the truck. And my understanding is that in that geography, it is standard practice to burn forest residue of that type, whether it looks large or not. That's sort of something of a subjective view for forest hygiene purposes, and that is clearly not a particularly effective climate outcome if this material is simply being burnt without energy recovery. So
you're supporting logging old growth forests in British Columbia at Drax. That's what I hear you saying. You think that it's okay to burn old growth forests. These are tiny, intact forest patches that are remnant patches that are globally. There's like literally only one rainforest like this in the world.
Mary, I think you make your point and let the colleague respond, and then we can go ahead.
Okay. I just want to make sure people understand what's going on here.
Well, thank you, Dirk, for giving me the opportunity to speak myself again. I didn't say that, Mary. I said that there are these controls in place, and I respect them. Whether that's forest management control, forest management certification controls, FM certification controls, or whether it's the legislation within BC. I did say that I realise that there are a range of views about what should be felled and what isn't. But I also know that there is a rigorous oversight of this in this particular geography. So
there's not rigorous oversight, obviously. I mean, you can say that all you want, but it's simply not true. It's obviously.
Mary, before we get into a ping pong discussion there, I think that's exactly what the house space is for, so we can really have a written exchange where everyone can actually provide links to documentation and to clear examples around it there. I think the time that we really would like to use for the plenary discussion is to allow lots of different voices so we can really scope the topic.
Thanks, Dirk. I would really appreciate if we can continue in that fashion. And Richard has already said that he will try to put something in the house space in response. So Mary, then you can respond again. And surely the issue will not be resolved today, but I think we improve on being transparent. That's our ambition, that we understand better the argumentation, and in case of doubt, we can continue. That's basically the rule we are working with. I would, from the discussion we had in the questions we have collected so far, there's one where I would like the US colleagues to respond to. And one is that, as you know, we have heard about the smallholder issue, the huge number of small operational foresters. And we know that not only from the US, it's also the case in other parts of the world. So group certification is something which was coming up maybe 20 years ago in the developing country perspective of certification schemes. Is it something you would see as an opportunity for the Europeans to be satisfied with, or do you see a fundamental difference between an individual certification scheme for forest operation and a kind of a bundled approach? Maybe Mike, you have a view on that, even if you are a large operator representing?
Yes, let me make a couple of comments on that. So first of all, as a large holder, we are not eligible to participate in a group. And I think that's currently based on probably revenue. I think it used to be years ago based on acres, but that's really irrelevant, I think, at this point. However, we are able to create a group if we elected to do that, and we could put smaller landholders in that group. I think our perspective is that we see many of the same auditors, we see many of the same practices required, whether it's smallholder or large holder, but ultimately it is that group owner that is accountable for ensuring that all members of their group are adhering to those practices. So I think probably someone like Dr. Jenkins and ENVIVA is better suited to answer that, because they're dealing with both small holders and large holders. So with that, I think I would, maybe defer to Jennifer on that.
Sure, Jennifer was on my list. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, so we do manage, we run two different groups. We started and we run a group under the American Tree Farm System, where we maintain and are responsible for, I think we have in our group now, I hesitate. We have a lot of acres in our group. 1 in every 7 tree farm acres in North Carolina actually belongs to our group. And we also maintain, or we work with Milliken Forestry to maintain a group under the FSC certification scheme as well. We just started that last year, and we were able to add, more than 10,000 acres into that group over the last 18 months. The requirements are the same, right? There's no difference in what the requirements are. The FSC is FSC, tree farm is tree farm. It doesn't, who the certification standards are exactly the same in the group. I think, the benefit for us is that we work, when we add landowners to a group, whether it's our group or a state-held tree farm group or the FSC group that is run by and managed by Milliken, we work, it's part of our portfolio of work we do directly with landowners to assist them in undertaking sustainable forest management. So, we're really pleased with that, because we enable access for landowners to professional forestry expertise, which is, the most important determinant of whether a landowner will engage in sustainable management. Far too few people in our region do engage directly with professional foresters. So we're in the business of trying to make sure that that happens more and more. And so we like our group for that reason. From a certification, sort of SBP certification point of view, that's not why we do it, for what that's worth.
Right. Uwe, we have 2 more questions. Let me just raise them and then we can see in which sequence. One was coming from Lorraine around if there's a clear overview study about biomass transport carbon footprint. And then Bas has raised his hand as well.
Great. I would say, Bas, we give you the floor. And Martin, would you ready to respond in the chat? Because you clearly have done a couple of studies on that. And so Lorraine would get the material. Is that okay?
Great. Good. So Bas, your floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks. So I don't want to go into detail on the discussion that was just going on between Ms. Booth and the person from Drex, but this shows exactly the difficulty for regulators, in what we're dealing with. We are operating in a world filled with good intentions and seemingly strong regulations and trusting schemes, but then again we get a lot of stories and pictures coming from the sector of possible things that are possibly going wrong. Let's just say it like that. So is then regulation like the RED II and certification to demonstrate compliance, is that then sufficient to negate these negative impacts or these irregularities maybe, or is it something else entirely? Is certification and regulation the answer to the possible things that are possibly going wrong in the sector? That is my question.
Thank you, Bas. I think it would be basically on the side of the regulators and of the operators to answer that, to what extent they feel vulnerable. And Bas, that IEA Bioenergy, if I can claim that for the moment, is working on a critical review of to what extent compliance and verification is actually operated to increase trust or consider improvements. So I think that's an issue from a scientific point of view. We will touch base early next year and so forth. But from you asked for the opinion, in my understanding. And opinion is something where I would invite a couple of people. Ernst, would you for Denmark say that the issue of the public view is something you fear? Is it okay? How do you deal with that in Denmark? To go away from the Netherlands for a moment.
Well, I said that the business here, the operating business, has been very active politically to encourage a stronger regulation, and well, I guess that is the answer on that. We are doing our business as everyone else in the political environment, and we have to follow we have to encourage and follow how the things are here, and we are a minor industry that has the influence we have by numbers. That's very small, so we have to adapt to what the majority thinks. And I think that is also, I mean, if one that's maybe on another level and not into your question, but if someone think that, well, now we go into certification, and then suddenly all these political issues that you have over the world, international and national, will be solved. Things that now there will be some more justice, since it's certification it's all about. Then you have a wrong expectation. So I think one have to consider the political realities that we're working in when you sort of judge whether this certification is doing their jobs or not.
Thank you for a very polite answer to a rather brutal question. I saw that we have also Lotta here with us. Lotta, if you would share a view from Finland, I invite you to. You can skip it, but I think it would be good. How do you see the issue of the vulnerability and certification as a trust-building mechanism?
Thank you, Uwe, for spotting me out. Although I'm representing all the European forest owners, I do have a strong background in Finland, where I think, like Ernst here said, it depends on much of the political environment, what is going on, but then also Finland has a strong history in forestry and forest industry, so that kind of it's fluctuating through time with the how economic is also going. Do we need the income? Is the forest industry doing well or not? So it's not a simple yes or no answer. There's a lot of parametrics around it.
Okay, thank you. I think Dirk more raised hands.
Rob is raising his hand.
Oh, cool. Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Are we not the sort of bottom of a soft target here, because the forest industry around the world produces a whole range of products, and the forest itself is pretty much agnostic to what happens to the lumber, etc., once it leaves and goes away on a truck or on a train. This is obviously a regulated industry, so the governments are calling the shots. But the toilet roll and the tissue industry, these are commodities which are often single use, and it's the same with packaging. And some of these products have no route to recycling for obvious reasons. And yet the consumer doesn't lie awake worrying about them at night. But what can we do to change the messaging here and to reconnect the consumer with the forest? Because we're all at the moment driving cars, well, some of us with fueled by fossil fuel, and some of the electricity is fueled by nuclear and coal and oil, etc. I mean, we should be confident in the message here that the data and the information coming out of these forests is demonstrating that what we do is actually good as opposed to bad. Where are we going wrong with the message?
Okay, I understood it as a plea for evidence and transparency. I think that's clearly something we need to get the trust, and the exchange we have here is hopefully a good example for that. I will not try to summarize a discussion which more or less just has started, but I think we can hear that the issue of certification and auditing and so forth is one thing, and the regulatory bodies will rely on that to some extent, at least in the RED II. On the other hand, there is evidence brought forward and of misuse and so forth, and that needs a careful examination. On the other hand, the question will always be, is one case representative for the whole industry? And surely it isn't. And to what extent more regulation is needed to contain misuse and so forth is clearly something we will have to deal with. Unfortunately, we don't have a participant in the moment from the Commission, as far as I'm aware. But in that case, I would bring the ball back into the Commission quarter and saying, hey, what do you think about that debate? But as I said, there's nobody participating, as far as I'm aware, at least officially. So I think we leave that as an open question. And we had in our collection of issues, one final, I just have to find it, just a sec. One issue which continues with the debate about member states and we heard about Denmark and the Netherlands, and there's some discussion in Belgium about going beyond the RED II. Now, a lot of member states, actually the absolute majority, has not declared anything to go beyond the RED. So what will that mean? That means there will be a few outsiders, and the mainstream goes ahead with what we're going to get from Brussels and the guidance we're going to get from the Commission. Is that the policy arena? And the few stray dogs will continue to go ahead, but they don't have a major market impact. Martin, what do you think?
Sorry, struggling to find the unmute button. I'm not sure. The fact that we haven't heard from the other member countries doesn't reassure me yet whether they're not also going to put up additional criteria. So that is a question mark. It may well be, But if that's the case, then I think for the domestic market, then indeed relatively little will change. Then again, the countries which we just mentioned, so Belgium, Denmark, the Netherlands, perhaps in the future, also Germany, and of course the UK leaving the EU, but still being a major consumer, all those countries that are importing have come up with these additional criteria. So for the international market, I think this is a major issue. For local markets, probably my very gut feeling is that the impact will be very limited.
Okay, thanks. Anyone from the speakers want to add to that perspective? Good, doesn't seem like. Then I would hand over to Dirk and close the plenary, that we have a few minutes to summarize and give perspectives also to the upcoming events, right? Is that okay, Dirk?
Yep, absolutely. Thanks so much, Uwe. And it looks like a really interesting debate and already a lot of topics relating to our next upcoming workshops around it there. I think is what we had prepared is a lot more specific questions as well, which I think would be really nice to have in a written form as we finish off this workshop here, but at least give everybody a chance to comment on those ones there as well, so we can actually feed it into the further process. So I've posted them at the end of the house space. And just feel free whenever you like to actually go and comment and post on it. It's a lot of topics we've already touched upon here, so at least we can continue that debate as we're going forward. Yeah, and especially the invitation for all the discussions that we started where we didn't have time to finalize them. Its house space is there until the end of the month and the next month to really keep this discussion alive and really share some documents and specific text around it there. Yeah. So in terms of going forward, is in terms of who can give us an outlook on the next session. There was a little bit, Martin. Yes.
Happy to. And this time I'm still unmuted, so I will go right ahead. So I think today we saw a continuation of the discussion we started 2 weeks ago. And I think perhaps even more fiercely, some claims being made about sustainability or unsustainability of biomass used, partially also regarding old growth, primary forests, etc., which of course also have an impact on biodiversity if we use them. And so the next workshop, which we will have in 3 weeks' time, will actually focus on biodiversity. So on the 9th of November, if I'm not mistaken, at the same time, there will be a dedicated session on biodiversity impacts, and we have 5 confirmed speakers. The first one will be Julian Petrovsky from Oxford University, summarizing kind of the overview of what science tells us on the possible impacts of biomass forest use for energy and other purposes on biodiversity. We then have from Copenhagen University, Vivian Kvist Johansen, talking about biodiversity and landscape level impacts. And then following her, we will have Olivia Schultz from the High Conservation Value Resource Network discussing how the standards as SPP are actually addressing this. And then we have 2 more speakers. One from NatureServe, Healy Hamilton, will discuss how can theoretical and scientific concepts actually be implemented and monitored on the ground. So again, making the bridge between regulation and science and actual implementation on the ground and measurable impacts. And last but not least, Adam Harrison from SPP about the work that SPP is doing on biodiversity. We are also still trying to get DG Agri and YUCN to join the debate. So those are invited, and we hope to hear back from them very soon. But in any case, I think it promises to be yet another very relevant discussion whether the current RED II criteria are sufficient or not, and what would be needed in order to safeguard biodiversity if we want to move beyond RED II. And then 3 weeks later, on the 30th of November, there's the 4th workshop, and I think that will be the one where I think we will maybe need twice the time, given the measure of attention has been given in the last 2 workshops, and that is on forest carbon accounting and the climate impacts of bioenergy, We will also there have a number of speakers which are already confirmed. Annette Cowie from Australia will give us an overview, let's say again, of what the science says, what the studies, what the literature has been providing on the climate impacts of bioenergy. And then we will have two speakers. One has been mentioned previously at the previous workshop prominently by several speakers, and that's Robert Matthews from the UK Forestry Commission. He has worked and advised the Commission. At the same time, we will also have Pat Howes, who was earlier on the call on this meeting as well. I'm not sure if she's still here. And she has closely, let's say, followed the developments in the UK. In both cases, we've seen attempts to regulate, let's say, or to determine the climate benefits also over time of bioenergy. And so we would like to hear back from them how these approaches were taken up or not. We will then also go into, let's say, the discussion on what does actually happen in the forest. So again, we will have a presentation from Drax talking about carbon forest stocks and how they actually developed around, let's say, the pellet plants that are using biomass, whether there's actually a decline or increase in those trends. And then we have two more speakers, which I unfortunately cannot confirm yet, but we're approaching, hopefully we will get from Fern. Oh, I forgot the name. Sorry, that's what you get when you don't write it down, a short blackout. So we will have another NGO discussing, and also hopefully a speaker from another certification scheme on how they actually measure the carbon, let's say, impacts of their products, not just energy related. So again, I think this will be a very important workshop to have, an important discussion to have. We will go into all these things like baselines and counterfactuals, whether carbon stocks in the forest are due, whether if they decline, it's due to overharvesting or because forests are getting too old and just aren't taking up less carbon, whether a useful counterfactual is a forest fire or assuming that the forest will continue to grow. All these nitty-gritty details and difficulties we will be able to discuss also there. And hopefully, I think we will aim to come to a conclusion how sustainability certification can at least make the right steps towards protecting or to achieve good biomass in terms of climate benefits. And then last but not least, it's still quite a long time to go, but Adam Harrison in January will lead the 5th workshop on social impacts of bioenergy. So I think we still have a very interesting program lined up, and I would encourage everybody who's participated today to also join us in 3 weeks' time. And of course, again, the house-based websites will remain a tool to, in front of the workshops, show those presentations. So please watch them so that we can go into the debate on the same page and really engage in meaningful discussions. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Martin. Mike, you've opened up our today's sessions. Any final thoughts or observations from your side?
No, we'd just like to, again, thank our speakers and organizers, but more important is the participation of each of you in these sessions. And we hope that your questions will help continue the dialogue and we'll build upon our future sessions. And we would encourage you to come back and visit the sessions that Martin just discussed. And we will make this information available. You know, you will be able to look at it, to download it, and please share it with others because I think they will find it interesting as well. So with that, we will conclude Workshop Series 2 and look forward to welcoming you to Workshops 3, 4, and 5 in the future. Thank you very much and have a good day.
Thanks.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.